What does that VR switch on your Nikon lens do? What does VR even mean? You are about to learn all this and a little bit more, so don't go away. Firstly, we need to look at what VR actually is. VR stands for Vibration Reduction. There are two sensors inside of the lens that detect horizontal and vertical movement. These sensors then send information to a microcomputer within your camera's body that moves certain parts of the lens to compensate for the movements and therefore eliminating the camera shake. And this gives you a better, sharper photo. But why does it do this? Why do you need it? Vibration reduction is designed to help you get better photos in low light situations. It enables you to use slower shutter speeds that you normally wouldn't be able to use when hand holding your camera because the camera shake your hands create would ruin your photos. It's also designed to work with stationary subjects, things that are not moving. So I'm sorry, but it's not going to freeze the motion of your kids playing soccer or those beautiful birds as they glide past fighting in midair. Now, Nikon claims that VR will effectively give you an extra 4.5 stops of light on some VR lenses. Now, when you consider that one stop of light is a doubling or halving of your shutter speed, that's a pretty significant improvement. This means that if I was using an AFP 70 to 300mm lens at 300mm with a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second, and I was finding I wasn't getting a really good exposure, I could switch VR on and effectively take that photo at 1/30th of a second and it would come out okay. Seems unbelievable, right? Well, with the 18 to 55mm here, apparently having VR switched on will gain me an extra 4 stops of light, so let's test it, shall we? Okay, so I've turned off all but one light here in my studio, and this is giving us a very low light situation. As you can see, I've got my 18 to 55mm lens on the camera here. What I'm going to do is take a photo of my keyboard on the desk behind me here, my computer keyboard. Now, currently my settings are 1/4 of a, oh hang on. What I'm going to do is, because I'm going to shoot this photo at 55mm, effectively to hand hold a shot at 55mm, you'd need a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second or greater to eliminate the camera shake. So I'm going to take a photo at 1/60th of a second to start off with. Now I've got my ISO at 320. I'll just show you my camera settings here. My aperture is f5.6 and my shutter speed is 1/60th of a second. And if I point this down towards the keyboard there, you can see it's very, very underexposed. So I'll take this shot. I've got my VR switched off. If you can see that, I'm not sure. VR is switched off. So I'll take this shot. And as you can see, that is very, very underexposed, and that's not what we want. So if VR gives us an extra 4 stops of light, let's see if we can get it. So I will turn the VR on. So if I go from 1/60th of a second to 1/30th, that is 1 stop of light, to 1/15th, that'll be 2 stops of light because 1 stop is a doubling or halving, remember. 3 stops of light would be around 1/8 of a second, and then 1/4 of a second will give us our 4 stops of light. So these are now my settings. Now, to hand hold a photo at 1/4 of a second at 55mm, you haven't got a hope. And I'll prove this by turning the VR off, and I will take a photo at 1/4 of a second, and you can see that's not a bad photo, but it's got a fair amount of motion blur in it. So let's turn our VR on and see if we effectively get our extra 4 stops of light. And looking at that photo there, that's pretty good. That is a usable photo. So 4 stops of light, Nikon are not kidding. So you can see from that example that having the VR switched on your Nikon lens can actually help you to take photos in low light situations at shutter speeds you normally would not be able to use. It really is handy for that. Now for those tips about VR I promised you if you stuck around. Now my first tip tip for using VR is turn it off. Yep, you heard me, turn it off. Most of the time you will not need it, especially if you are a bird photographer or a wildlife photographer. Having VR switched on while you're tracking a moving animal will cause vibration in the lens because the VR system will be trying to compensate for all that movement. This will rob your photos of sharpness, so turn it off. My second tip is to always turn your VR off when you have your camera on a tripod. Now I say this for the same reason as the last tip, and it is because if you have your camera on that tripod and there is any movement whatsoever in that tripod and therefore your camera, the VR will be trying to compensate for that, and it will rob your photos of their sharpness, especially when you are using really, really long shutter speeds. If you're taking photos of waterfalls and you're getting those nice, soft, smoky looking water shots, you sometimes are using shutter speeds way longer than 1 second. If you have your VR on and there's any movement during that time that the shutter is open, the VR will be trying to compensate, and it will rob those photos of their sharpness, so turn it off when you're on a tripod. So basically, just leave your VR turned off unless you're in a low light situation, hand holding your camera, and you need that extra little bit of help to use this really slow shutter speed. So hopefully you now understand a lot more about VR, about what it is, and when to use it and when not to use it.